Hedy Lamarr was the victim of the most insane medical regimen in cinema history. Daily injections of methamphetamine disguised as vitamins to work like a machine. They pumped chemicals into her body to sustain the life of the blueprint for Snow White and Catwoman, the standard of beauty that tycoon Louis B. Mayer wanted the world to worship as a goddess. But behind that doll-like exterior was the brilliant mind of an engineer who invented the foundation for Wi-Fi and GPS, an intellect that Hollywood viewed as a burden and sought to extinguish. The result was a corroded brain, leading to manic episodes of climbing trees screaming and finally being arrested for petty shoplifting due to memory loss. She gave the world the technology of the future, but Hollywood repaid her with insanity and a pair of handcuffs. A celebrated Austrian star marked by her Jewish heritage, Hedwig Kiesler had fled the encroaching Nazi shadow for London, yet she knew Europe was on the brink of war. Seizing her only chance for American sanctuary, she targeted Louis B. Mayer, the visiting MGM mogul, determined to turn a business meeting into a grand escape. Louis B. Mayer, the head of MGM, was in London fishing for stars in the troubled waters of Europe, looking for desperate talent he could secure for cheap. He agreed to meet Hedwig. He had seen ecstasy. He was intrigued by her notoriety, but he was a prude. He was the guardian of American morality on screen. He offered her a contract, but the terms were insulting. He offered her $125 a week, a pittance. He wanted to own her, much like her former husband Mandel had, but at a bargain price. To Mayer, she was not a person, she was an acquisition. He looked at her and saw a face that could sell millions of tickets, but he had zero interest in the mind behind the eyes. In fact, her intelligence was a liability. Mayer famously preferred his actresses to be compliant, grateful, and silent. A woman who could discuss ballistics and engineering was a threat to his control. He wanted a doll he could dress up, pose, and profit from, not a partner who would question his authority. Hedwig Kiesler, the girl who understood electric streetcars, the woman who had outwitted an arms dealer, looked at the most powerful man in Hollywood and said no. It was a gamble of breathtaking audacity. She was a refugee with dwindling funds, rejecting the only lifeline she had. She walked out, but Hedwig was a strategist. She knew Mayer was booking passage back to New York on the luxury liner, Normandy. She knew that on a ship there is nowhere to run. The captive environment of a transatlantic crossing was the perfect stage for her next move. She used the last of her money to book a ticket on the same ship. When she walked into the dining room of the Normandy, she was not the desperate refugee who had refused $125 a week. She was dressed in her finest remaining clothes. She wore the jewelry she had smuggled out. She radiated wealth, confidence, and unapproachable beauty. She charmed everyone in the room. The flashbulbs popped. The passengers whispered. Louis B. Mayer watched from his table as this woman, whom he had dismissed, became the center of the universe. He realized he could not let her sign with a rival studio. The sheer force of her charisma bent his will. By the time the Normandy docked in New York, Hedwig had a new contract. She would be paid $500 a week. She was going to be a star. But there was one final condition, a condition that would strip her of her history. Mayer told her, "I cannot put a girl named Kiesler on the marquee. It sounds too foreign. It sounds too Jewish." He looked at her, this survivor of Austrofascism, this brilliant amateur engineer, and he renamed her. He named her after Barbara Lamarr, a silent film star known as the girl who was too beautiful, who had died tragically of a drug overdose years earlier. It was a grim bit of foreshadowing, a curse disguised as a stage name. Hedwig Kiesler was dead. Hedy Lamarr was born. The ink on the contract was dry, and the name change was official. Hedwig Kiesler had successfully fled the arms dealers of Europe, only to walk voluntarily into the machinery of American entertainment. But as the lights of Hollywood beckoned, a fundamental conflict was brewing. Louis B. Mayer had purchased a face to project on silver screens, but he had absolutely no use for the mind that had engineered the escape. The curtain was about to rise on a performance that would require Hedy to split herself in two. The goddess the public worshipped, and the engineer the industry ignored. Los Angeles, 1938. The Great Depression is still holding onto the edges of American life, but in Hollywood, business is booming. This is the era of the studio system, a time when movie studios operated like assembly lines. They didn't just make movies, they manufactured stars. And Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, MGM, had just acquired a new raw material, Hedy Lamarr. Her arrival in Hollywood was calculated with military precision. Louis B. Mayer, a master of publicity, unleashed a marketing blitz before her first American film, Algiers, even hit the theaters. The taglines were breathless: "The most beautiful woman in the world." When the film was released, the impact was instantaneous. Hedy Lamarr didn't just become a star, she became a mania. American women who had spent the decade emulating the blonde curls of Shirley Temple or the platinum edge of Jean Harlow suddenly shifted. Hedy's look, raven black hair parted strictly in the middle, pale skin, dark lips, became the new standard. Actresses like Joan Bennett literally dyed their hair to mimic her. The Hedy Lamarr look swept the nation. It was a visual revolution, redefining glamour for an entire generation. But behind the velvet ropes, the reality was far more sterile. Mayer kept his promise. He treated her as a doll. He cast her in roles that required almost no acting ability, only a devastating physical presence. She played the native girl, the seductress, the mystery woman. She had very few lines. The camera would simply linger on her face, and the audience would gasp. The studio didn't want her to act. They wanted her to exist as a static object of desire. Hedy famously summed up her own career with a quote that was both witty and deeply cynical. "Any girl can be glamorous. All you have to do is stand still and look stupid." She was bored. The restless intellect that had dissected printing presses in Vienna was now being asked to sit in a makeup chair for 3 hours a day. She was surrounded by people who spoke only of box office receipts and gossip. She found the Hollywood party scene dull. While her peers were out at Kiro's or the Trocadero, drinking and dancing, Hedy Lamarr went home. Imagine a mansion in Beverly Hills. It is filled with the trappings of wealth, expensive rugs, fine art, servants. But in one room, the decor changes. There is a drafting table. There are stacks of engineering books. There is a wall of tools. This was Hedy's sanctuary. She was a nocturnal creature. After a long day of standing still and looking stupid at MGM, she would come home, wipe off the makeup, and begin her real work. She was a compulsive inventor. She looked at the world and saw inefficiencies that needed fixing. She sketched a design for a new type of traffic stoplight. She attempted to invent a tablet that, when dropped into water, would turn into a carbonated cola for soldiers at the front lines. This one was a failure. She later laughed that it tasted like shoe polish, but the chemistry behind it was sound. She even gave advice to her friend Howard Hughes. Hughes, the aviation tycoon, was struggling with the design of his airplanes. He wanted them to fly faster. Hedy looked at his designs, then looked at books on nature. She studied the anatomy of fish and birds. She told Hughes his wings were too square. She sketched a more aerodynamic swept wing design based on the shape of a fish. Hughes, to his credit, listened. He reportedly told her, "You are a genius." But these were small projects. Hedy's mind was still tethered to the trauma she had left behind in Europe. It is 1940. World War II is raging. America has not yet entered the fight, but the news from the Atlantic is grim. Hedy was an Austrian. She had fled the fascists, but she had not forgotten them. She read the papers with growing horror. Nazi U-boats, submarines, were decimating Allied shipping. Ships carrying children, refugees, and supplies were being blown out of the water. Hedy's mind went back to the dinner table at Schwarzau Castle. She remembered the generals. She remembered the talk of radio-controlled torpedoes. She knew the flaw. A radio-controlled torpedo was the perfect weapon, but it had an Achilles heel. The ship guiding the torpedo had to send a signal on a specific radio frequency. If the Nazis could find that frequency, they could jam it. It was like two people talking on a phone line. If a third person screams on the line, the conversation is over. The torpedo would lose its way and miss the target. She thought, what if the frequency wasn't static? What if it moved? She conceptualized a system where the transmitter on the ship and the receiver on the torpedo would jump from frequency to frequency in a synchronized pattern, like a game of musical chairs, but played at the speed of light. Even if the Nazis found one frequency, by the time they tried to jam it, the signal would have already moved to the next one. It was called frequency hopping. The idea was brilliant. It was mathematically sound. But Hedy Lamarr was not a mechanic. She knew what needed to happen, but she didn't know how to build a machine small enough to fit inside a torpedo that could execute these jumps perfectly. She needed a partner. Enter George Antheil. If Hedy Lamarr was the most unlikely engineer in Hollywood, George Antheil was the most unlikely partner she could have found. Antheil was an avant-garde composer, a self-described bad boy of music. He was famous for a piece called Ballet Mécanique, a chaotic industrial symphony that used airplane propellers, sirens, and, crucially, 16 synchronized player pianos. They met at a dinner party in Hollywood. The initial attraction wasn't romantic, it was intellectual. Hedy had read about Antheil's work with glands and endocrinology. He was a man of strange and varied interests, and she wanted his advice on how to increase her bust size. But the conversation quickly pivoted from anatomy to weaponry. Hedy explained her idea for the radio-hopping torpedo. She explained the problem of synchronization. How do you get two machines miles apart to switch channels at the exact same split second without a wire connecting them? Antheil's eyes lit up. He didn't think about electronics, he thought about pianos, but he told her about ballet mécanique. He explained that he had synchronized 16-player pianos using paper rolls perforated with holes. As the paper unspooled, the holes triggered the keys. If we can synchronize pianos, they realized, we can synchronize radios. They began to work. Hedy sketched the electronic architecture. Antheil worked on the mechanical synchronization. They designed a system that used a miniaturized player piano mechanism, a small roll of paper perforated with a complex pattern would be placed inside the torpedo. A matching roll would be on the ship. When activated, the rolls would spin. The holes in the paper would trigger the radio frequencies to change. Because the rolls were identical and started at the same time, the ship and the torpedo would hop together in perfect harmony. To honor the inspiration, they designed the system to use 88 radio frequencies, the number of keys on a standard piano. They worked on the floor of Hedy's living room, amidst cigarette smoke and scattered papers. It was a feverish collaboration. Hedy provided the vision and the technical understanding of the weapon. Antheil provided the mechanical solution. In 1941, they submitted their idea to the National Inventors Council. The council, surprisingly, was impressed. They encouraged the pair to file for a patent. On August 11th, 1942, United States Patent number 2,292,387 was granted to Hedy Lamarr, her married name at the time, and George Antheil, for a secret communication system. It was done. They had solved one of the biggest technical problems of the war. They had a patent that could make Allied torpedoes unjammable. It was a weapon that could save thousands of lives. Hedy was ecstatic. She was a patriot. She didn't want money. She wanted to give the patent to the United States Navy as a contribution to the war effort. Then came the scene that defined the rest of her life. Hedy and George secured a meeting with the U.S. Navy brass. You can imagine the room. Stern men in stiff uniforms, career military officers, engineers who had spent their lives studying ballistics. And in walks the most beautiful woman in the world, accompanied by an eccentric musician. They placed the blueprints on the table. They explained the concept of frequency hopping. They explained the paper rolls. The Navy officers looked at the blueprints. Then they looked at Hedy. They did not see a peer. They did not see an inventor. They saw the girl from Ecstasy. They saw the face on the movie poster. The idea of putting a player piano inside a torpedo sounded absurd to them. It was too bulky, they argued, though Antheil insisted it could be miniaturized. It was too complex. But the real objection was unspoken. This is not where technology comes from. Technology comes from laboratories and men with glasses, not from Hollywood actresses. They rejected the invention. They took the patent, stamped it top secret, and filed it away in a dusty cabinet. It was classified, meaning Hedy and George couldn't even sell it to a private company to develop it. It was effectively seized and buried. Then, one of the officers turned to Hedy. He offered her advice that was meant to be helpful, but was devastatingly patronizing. "Miss Lamarr," he reportedly said, "if you really want to help the war effort, you shouldn't be tinkering with blueprints. You should use your assets." He meant her face. He meant her charm. "Go out and sell war bonds," he told her. "That is how a girl like you helps." Hedy Lamarr was crushed. Her intellect had been dismissed. Her contribution had been laughed out of the room. But she was also a woman of immense discipline. If they wouldn't let her use her brain, she would use what they wanted. She swallowed her pride. She went on a war bond tour. She traveled across America, exhausted, smiling, waving. She developed a gimmick. She would offer a kiss to anyone who bought $25,000 worth of bonds. She sold $25 million worth of bonds. That is over $340 million in today's currency. She was a hero. The press loved her. The government loved her. But every time she smiled for a camera, every time she sold a bond, a part of her was dying. She knew that in a filing cabinet in Washington, D.C., the solution to the torpedo problem, her solution, was gathering dust. The rejection confirmed her deepest fear. The world would never let her be anything other than a face. And as the war ended and the 1940s dragged on, the boredom and the frustration returned. Hedy was back in the studio system, back to standing still and looking stupid. But the human spirit can only endure so much suppression. To keep going, to keep smiling, to keep working the 18-hour days that MGM demanded, Hedy needed help. And the studio was more than happy to provide it. The vitamins were waiting. With the Navy's rejection echoing in her ears, the patent that could have changed the war was filed away in the darkness of a government cabinet. Hedy had been told her place was to smile, not to think. She obeyed, throwing herself into the war bond effort with patriotic fervor, selling millions with a kiss. But as the adrenaline of the war faded and the relentless grind of the studio system resumed, The psychological wound of that dismissal began to fester. To keep the smile fixed in place for the cameras 18 hours a day, sheer willpower was no longer enough. She would soon need something stronger. The year is 1945. The war is over. The soldiers are coming home. But for Hedy Lamarr, there is no victory parade. There is only the call sheet. She returned to Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, but something fundamental had shifted. The rejection by the Navy had severed her connection to her own potential. She had offered the world her mind, and the world had politely declined, asking instead for her body. Resigned, Hedy threw herself into the only role she was allowed to play, the movie star. But the Hollywood of the mid-1940s was a grueling machine. The demand for content was insatiable. Stars were expected to film back-to-back productions, appearing at publicity events, costume fittings, and radio interviews in between. A typical day for Hedy Lamarr began at 4:30 a.m. in the makeup chair and often ended past midnight. It was a schedule that defied human biology. You cannot maintain physical perfection and boundless energy for 18 hours a day, 6 days a week on willpower alone. The studio executives knew this. Louis B. Mayer ran MGM like a factory. And in a factory, you do not let the machinery slow down just because it is tired. You lubricate it. MGM, like all major studios of the era, had a sophisticated medical infrastructure. They had studio doctors on the payroll. These men were not there to ensure the long-term health of the actors. They were there to ensure production did not stop. When Hedy began to flag, when the dark circles appeared under her eyes, she was not sent home to sleep. She was sent to the infirmary for a vitamin shot. It is important to understand the medical context of this era. This was before the strict regulation of controlled substances. The pick-me-up was a standard tool in the studio's arsenal. Hedy was told she was receiving B12 calcium and perhaps some animal hormones or glandular extracts for vitality. It was a lie, or at best a half-truth. The shots were cocktails. They often contained a base of vitamins, yes, but the active ingredient was methamphetamine, pure speed. This was the dark secret of the Golden Age. To maintain the illusion of the tireless goddess, Louis B. Mayer and his peers turned their actors into junkies. The studio doctor, with his black bag, was as essential to the production as the cameraman. They created a workforce of high-functioning addicts, chemically enslaved to the schedule. This was the evergreen tragedy of Hollywood, the systemic waste of human talent, burning out bright minds with hard drugs just to keep the product moving. Hedy described this sensation in her later years. She said that moments after the needle went in, the exhaustion evaporated. A surge of chemical euphoria would wash over her. She felt she could climb trees. She felt she could run for miles. Her mind, previously fogged by fatigue, would suddenly race with 1,000,000 ideas a minute. She was charming. She was energetic. She was the doll that Mayer wanted. This is the textbook physiological response to methamphetamine intoxication. For a woman who was already prone to high anxiety and restlessness, the drug was like jet fuel poured on a fire. It allowed her to work, yes, but it began to rewire her brain. What goes up must come down. The laws of physics applied to neurochemistry. After a 14-hour day fueled by speed, Hedy would return to her mansion, her body trembling with artificial energy. Her heart would be racing. Sleep was impossible. She would pace the floors, cleaning, organizing, sketching, unable to shut down. So the studio doctors provided the antidote. If the morning shot was the gas pedal, the evening pill was the brake. They prescribed barbiturates, Seconal, Tunol, Nembutal. These were powerful sedative hypnotics, strong enough to knock out a horse. Hedy entered a cycle that destroyed many of her contemporaries, including the tragic Judy Garland. It was a chemical seesaw, uppers to wake, downers to sleep. This regimen is devastating to the human central nervous system. It destroys the body's ability to regulate its own emotions. It induces paranoia. It creates severe mood swings. It erodes the ability to make rational judgments. Hedy began to hear things. She began to see enemies in the shadows. The genius mind that had visualized frequency hopping was now misfiring, overheating from the chemical abuse. By the late 1940s, the eccentricities of Hedy Lamarr, her temper, her sudden disappearances, her erratic behavior on set, were becoming legendary. The industry labeled her difficult. They labeled her a diva. They did not label her what she actually was, a high-functioning drug addict, created and sustained by the terms of her employment. Mayer had turned the genius into a liability, and then blamed her for breaking. The tragedy of this addiction was not limited to Hedy's own body. The most heartbreaking aspect of the studio's control is how it poisoned her role as a mother. Hedy had 3 children. Like any parent, she wanted them to be happy, healthy, and successful. But her perception of health had been warped by the studio doctors. She trusted these men in white coats. She believed the shots were medicine. She believed the pills were vitamins. Her son, Anthony Loder, later recounted a story that chills the blood. As a young boy, Anthony was sometimes lethargic or unfocused, normal behavior for a growing child. Hedy, observing this, did what she had been trained to do. She wanted to fix him. She consulted her doctors, and, incredibly tragically, she began administering the same vitamin pills to her own children. Anthony Loder developed an addiction to amphetamines that would plague him for decades. This was not malice. This was not abuse in the intentional sense. It was the horrific trickle-down effect of institutional gaslighting. Hedy Lamarr loved her children, but she had been brainwashed into believing that chemical stimulation was the key to functioning in the world. The damage inflicted by Louis B. Mayer didn't stop with Hedy. It was passed down to the next generation. By the 1950s, the studio system was collapsing. The Supreme Court had broken up the monopoly of the theater chains. Television was rising. The era of the gods and goddesses was ending. Hedy's career began to slide. The drugs had taken a toll on her appearance and her reliability. She produced a few films herself, showing her business acumen, but the erratic behavior made her uninsurable. She retreated. She moved to Texas, then to various other locations, and finally settled in Florida. As she aged, the isolation grew. The paranoia, a classic symptom of long-term amphetamine abuse, became severe. She believed her phone was tapped. She believed people were spying on her. She initiated lawsuits against everyone, often for perceived slights. The drugs had etched a permanent groove of suspicion into her neural pathways. And then came the headlines that reduced her legacy to a punchline. In 1966 and again in 1991, Hedy Lamarr was arrested for shoplifting. The tabloids devoured the story, the fallen goddess, the kleptomaniac star. In the 1991 incident in Castleberry, Florida, she was caught stealing laxatives and eye drops. The total value was roughly $21. When the police searched her purse, they found thousands of dollars in cash. She didn't steal because she was poor. She didn't steal because she was criminal. To understand these arrests, we must look at them through a modern medical lens. We now know that chronic high-dose amphetamine abuse causes neurotoxicity. It damages the frontal lobes of the brain. This is the area responsible for executive function, impulse control, and judgment. Damage to this area often manifests as senseless, repetitive behaviors. Kleptomania, the compulsion to steal items one does not need, is a known symptom of this type of frontal lobe dysfunction, as well as certain forms of dementia. Hedy Lamarr wasn't a thief. She was brain damaged. She was displaying the late-stage symptoms of the chemical regimen she was forced onto 40 years prior. The pills Mayer's doctors gave her in 1945 were still working in her system in 1991, claiming the final pieces of her dignity. But the world didn't see a medical patient. They saw a crazy old woman. There was one final cruelty. Hedy had always been valued for one thing, her face. It was her currency. It was the only thing the world accepted from her. As she aged, she became terrified of losing it. The paranoia about her looks became an obsession. She began undergoing plastic surgery. This was the infancy of cosmetic surgery. The techniques were not refined. Hedy endured facelift after facelift, trying to stretch the skin back to the perfection of 1938. The results were disastrous. Her features became distorted. The face that had inspired Snow White was pulled tight, a cruel caricature of its former glory. She knew it. The shame was overwhelming. She became a recluse in her Florida home. She refused to see visitors. She would spend hours on the telephone talking to her children or the few friends she had left, but she would not let them see her. She had been the most beautiful woman in the world. Now she felt like a monster. As the years turned into decades, Hedy Lamarr became a prisoner of her own mythology. She trapped herself in Florida, unwilling to let the public see the ravages of time on the face that was once their idol. But while her physical form was decaying in darkness, the spark of her genius was igniting in the wider world. The irony was absolute. Just as the most beautiful woman vanished from sight, the invisible architecture of her mind was silently beginning to conquer the globe. The actress was fading, but the inventor was about to be born. While Hedy Lamarr was retreating into the shadows of Florida, hiding a face she no longer recognized, the ghost of her intellect was beginning to haunt the machinery of the Cold War. For nearly 2 decades, the patent she and George Antheil had filed, patent 2,292,387, had sat in a classified file in the United States Patent Office. It was a dormant seed. The Navy of 1942 had been too short-sighted to see its value. They couldn't get past the player-piano mechanism. But ideas, unlike movie stars, do not age. They wait. In the mid-1950s, the patent was rediscovered by engineers at Sylvania Electronic Systems. The technology landscape had changed. The transistor had replaced the vacuum tube. The clumsy mechanical rolls of paper that George Antheil had envisioned could now be replaced by solid-state electronics. The engineers looked at the concept of frequency hopping and realized it wasn't just a novelty. It was the solution to a terrifying new problem. The Cold War was a game of cat and mouse played in the silence of the deep ocean. The U.S. Navy needed a way to track Soviet submarines without the Soviets jamming the signal. They needed a secure line of communication for their sonobuoys, floating listening devices dropped from airplanes. They dusted off Hedy's concept. They didn't call it the Lamarr-Antheil system. They simply called it spread spectrum. But the DNA was unmistakable. In 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest the world has ever come to nuclear annihilation, the U.S. Navy deployed the technology on a blockade scale. The secure communications that helped manage that crisis, that kept the blockade ships connected and unjammable, utilized the frequency hopping principles Hedy had sketched on her drafting table 20 years earlier. Hedy knew none of this. Her patent had expired. In the eyes of the law, her ownership of the idea had evaporated. The military was using her mind to save the world while she was struggling to pay her grocery bills. Then came the second revolution. In the 1980s, the U.S. military decided to declassify spread spectrum technology. They released it to the public domain. This was the moment the dam broke. The world was on the precipice of the wireless age, but there was a massive engineering hurdle. How do you allow millions of people to talk on mobile phones or connect computers to a network without the signals crashing into each other? If everyone broadcasts on the same frequency, it is chaos. It is a room full of people screaming. Civilian engineers remembered Hedy's solution. Don't stay on one frequency, hop. They adapted frequency hopping into what we now know as CDMA, Code Division Multiple Access. This became the backbone of 3G mobile networks. It became the fundamental architecture of Wi-Fi, 802.11. It became the protocol for Bluetooth. Consider the irony. The technology was originally designed to guide a torpedo, a weapon of destruction. Instead, it became the fabric of global connection. Every time a teenager sent a text message in the 1990s, every time a businessman checked his email in an airport, every time a photo was uploaded to the nascent World Wide Web, it was riding on the back of Hedy Lamarr's genius. The silence of her seclusion in Florida was inversely proportional to the noise she was generating around the globe. She was everywhere, yet she was nowhere. By the late 1990s, Hedy was in her 80s. She was living in Castleberry, Florida, in a modest house. She had become a ghost. She rarely left her bedroom. She spent her days watching television, often seeing her younger self flickering on the screen in reruns of Samson and Delilah or Algiers. She was bitter. She felt the world had stolen from her. She spoke of her invention occasionally to her children, but it sounded like the ramblings of an old woman. "I invented that," she would say, pointing at a piece of military tech on the news. It was hard to believe. But the history of science is filled with archaeologists, people who dig for the truth. A few eagle-eyed computer scientists and historians began to piece the timeline together. They found the patent. They saw the name, Hedy Markey. They connected the dots. Word began to spread in the tech community. The mother of Wi-Fi was the most beautiful woman in the world. In 1997, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, EFF, a leading nonprofit defending digital rights, decided to correct the historical record. They voted to award Hedy Lamarr their Pioneer Award. It is the Oscar of the coding world. They called her on the telephone. Hedy refused to meet them. She refused to come to the ceremony. She was too ashamed of her appearance. She would not let the world see the ruined face. But she took the call. When the representative explained that they knew what she had done, that they recognized her engineering genius, and that they wanted to honor her, she didn't cry. She didn't gush with gratitude. Her response was sharp, dry, and classic Hedy. She paused and said, "Well, it's about time." The award was a vindication, but it was not a paycheck. We must address the economics of this tragedy. The market value of the technologies that rely on frequency hopping spread spectrum, Wi-Fi, GPS, Bluetooth, military satellites, is estimated today to be roughly $30 billion. Hedy Lamarr never made a single dime from her invention because the patent had been classified during its active years and then expired before the commercial explosion. She missed the window of royalties. She lived on a Screen Actors Guild pension, which was modest. She lived in a small home. She shopped at the local drugstore. There is a profound injustice here that goes beyond money. It is about the theft of credit. For 50 years, when people thought of Hedy Lamarr, they thought of a pretty face who faded away. They should have been thinking of a titan of industry, Thomas Edison, Alexander Graham Bell, Hedy Lamarr. That is the pantheon where she belonged. Instead, the industry that owned her image made millions off her films, and the industry that used her brain made billions off her patent, while she died worrying about the cost of eye drops. January 19th, 2000. The new millennium had just begun. The world was gripped by the Y2K panic, a fear of a digital crash. The entire globe was obsessed with computers, networks, and connectivity. In Castleberry, Florida, Hedy Lamarr passed away in her sleep. She was 85 years old. The cause of death was heart failure, the long-term, cumulative result of the stress and the stimulants that had battered her system for half a century. She died alone. Her son Anthony arrived to clear out the house. It was a sad, cluttered space. But among the debris of a life lived in hiding, he found evidence of the mind that never slept. He found art supplies. He found writings. And he found a tape recording she had made for him. On the tape, Hedy reads a poem. It is often attributed to Mother Teresa, known as the Anyway poem. Her voice, raspy with age but still possessing that Viennese cadence, recites the lines, "People are unreasonable, illogical, and self-centered. Love them anyway. If you do good, people will accuse you of selfish, ulterior motives. Do good anyway. The biggest men and women with the biggest ideas can be shot down by the smallest men and women with the smallest minds. Think big anyway. What you spend years building may be destroyed overnight. Build it anyway." It was her epitaph. She had built something monumental. It had been ignored, stolen, and hidden, but she had built it anyway. The newspapers the next day ran the standard obituaries. Hollywood screen siren dies. Ecstasy star dead at 85. They printed the old photos of her face, but in the engineering journals, in the chat rooms of the early internet, and in the laboratories of Silicon Valley, a different kind of mourning was taking place. The geeks were mourning their queen. The woman was gone, but the frequency was still hopping. The news of her death in January 2000 was met with a brief flicker of nostalgia for the golden age, a final curtain call for a woman the world thought it knew, but the end of her biological life marked the beginning of her historical resurrection. As the 21st century dawned, the irony of her existence would finally be resolved. She would not remain a footnote in a film history book or a punchline in a tabloid. She was about to embark on a final journey home, one that would realign her legacy forever. Death is usually the end of a biography. For Hedy Lamarr, it was the beginning of the truth. In the weeks following her death in 2000, her son, Anthony Loder, fulfilled her final wish. It was a wish that revealed where her heart had truly lived, all those years she spent in the artificial sunlight of California and the dark seclusion of Florida. She did not want to be buried in Hollywood. She did not want to be buried in the United States. She wanted to go home. Anthony traveled to Vienna. He carried her ashes to the Vienna woods, Wienerwald, the dense green forest that hugs the edge of the city. This was the landscape of her innocence. These were the woods where her father, Emil, had walked with her 80 years prior, explaining how the world worked before the world tried to break her. Anthony scattered half of her ashes among the trees. The ecstasy girl, the most beautiful woman in the world, the enemy alien, the movie star, all those masks were dissolved. She was just Hedwig Kiesler again, resting in the soil of the city that made her. But the story did not dissolve with her ashes. In fact, the silence she left behind allowed the signal to finally be heard clearly. The rehabilitation of Hedy Lamarr's reputation was not immediate, but it was unstoppable. For decades, her obituary would have led with Samson and Delilah. It would have mentioned her 6 marriages. It would have mentioned the scandals. The invention would have been a footnote, a fun fact at the bottom of the page. But as the 21st century progressed, a cultural shift occurred. The information age that we live in began to look for its founding fathers. And to their surprise, they found a founding mother. In 2014, 14 years after her death and a century after her birth, Hedy Lamarr was inducted into the National Inventors Hall of Fame. Think about that roster. She sits alongside Thomas Edison, the Wright brothers, and Eli Whitney. The patent that the Navy scoffed at, patent 2,292,387, is now framed in the halls of American history, treated as a sacred text of telecommunications. Then came the visual correction. In 2017, the documentary Bombshell, the Hedy Lamarr story, produced by Susan Sarandon and directed by Alexandra Dean, was released. It did something crucial. It played the audio tapes. For the first time, the world didn't just look at Hedy, they heard her. They heard the cassette tapes she had recorded in her final years, where she spoke with bitterness, wit, and startling clarity about her life. They heard the voice of the engineer. The film stripped away the Hollywood gloss and laid bare the tragedy of the studio system. It forced the audience to confront a harsh reality. We, the public, were complicit. We consumed her beauty and ignored her mind. The documentary sparked a global reevaluation. Hedy Lamarr became an icon for a new generation, not for her cheekbones, but for her brain. She became the patron saint of women in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Today, the legacy of Hedy Lamarr is not measured in film reels. It is measured in data packets. It is difficult to overstate the ubiquity of the door she opened. We live in a world that is defined by wireless. We assume connectivity is like air, invisible and everywhere. Wi-Fi. When you sit in a coffee shop and work on your laptop, the modem is constantly hopping frequencies to maintain a clear signal amidst the noise of dozens of other devices. That is Hedy. Bluetooth. When you put in your wireless earbuds, the connection is maintained by a specialized form of frequency hopping. That is Hedy. GPS. The satellites orbiting the Earth that guide your car and tag your location. Use spread spectrum technology to prevent signal interference from space radiation and enemy jamming. That is Hedy. In a supreme irony, the technology she designed to destroy Nazis is now the technology that connects humanity. It is the technology that allows a teenager in Tokyo to video chat with a grandmother in Toronto. It is the technology that allows dissidents in oppressive regimes to bypass censorship. She designed a weapon of war, but she created the ultimate tool of peace, communication. After a forensic investigation into the destruction of a mind, the verdict is clear. Hollywood is guilty. The studio system of the 1930s and 40s was a predatory machine that extracted youth and beauty, injected chemicals, and discarded the husk. It took a genius and told her to act like a fool. It took a scientist and told her to sell kisses. It took a woman who invented the future and made her addicted to meth so she could film B movies. But the verdict on Hedy Lamarr is one of vindication. She won. It took her a lifetime, and she didn't live to see the victory parade, but she won. Louis B. Mayer is dead. His studio system is gone. The films of that era are largely museum pieces, watched by film students and historians. The definition of beauty from 1940 is a relic. But Hedy's mind? Her mind is alive. Her mind is in your pocket right now. Her mind is in the dashboard of your car. Her mind is in the hospital equipment monitoring patients wirelessly. She defied the categorization that Mayer tried to brand onto her skin. He said she was the doll. She proved she was the architect. There is a concept in physics called the conservation of energy. Energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only change form. Hedy Lamarr was a force of energy that the world tried to contain. They tried to trap it in a marriage to a fascist. They tried to trap it in a contract with MGM. They tried to numb it with amphetamines. They tried to hide it behind a beautiful face. But energy cannot be destroyed. It escaped. It moved from the drafting table to the patent office. It moved from the patent office to the Navy ships. It moved from the ships to the cell towers. So the next time your phone connects to the internet, watch the little icon in the corner of your screen. Watch the bars light up. That is not just a signal. That is a heartbeat. That is the brilliant, tortured, unstoppable mind of Hedwig Kiesler, finally speaking to us in a frequency that cannot be jammed. The broadcast is clear. The connection is stable. Hedy Lamarr is finally heard.